The mansion stood high on the hill, quiet and wide like it was watching over the city below. People said it looked beautiful at sunset, when the glass windows turned gold and the long driveway shone like silver. But for the people who worked there, that beauty was mixed with fear. The place was known for one thing: no maid ever lasted. Every few weeks, a new face arrived at the gates, full of hope, dressed in a crisp uniform, ready to earn a living. And every few weeks, that same face left in tears, bags packed, heart heavy, and promises broken. The mansion seemed to swallow good intentions and spit out disappointment. The reason, everyone said, was not the house itself, but the woman who lived in it. Vivian Montgomery, the billionaire's new wife, was as mysterious as she was feared. Her husband, Charles, was a quiet man who had made his fortune in steel and technology. People rarely saw him, and when they did, he was polite but distant. Vivian was different. She loved being noticed, loved being the one people whispered about. She had a beauty that demanded attention, elegant dresses, diamonds that caught the light, and a face that gave away nothing. But behind that face, everyone could sense a storm. The staff whispered stories about her. Some said she once threw a tray at a maid who spilled juice on a rug imported from Italy. Others said she fired a woman for breathing too loudly during dinner. Whether those stories were true or not didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the fear they created. The mansion had become a revolving door of workers who tried, failed, and left. When a new maid was needed again, the head of staff placed another ad. The position came with good pay, better than most jobs in the area. But even so, very few people applied. Those who did usually backed out once they learned where they'd be working. That was when Clara Jenkins arrived. She came from a small town several hours away. Her life had been full of quiet battles. Raising her daughter alone, working in hotels, cleaning rooms that guests had left in chaos, smiling even when her back ached. She didn't complain much. She just worked, prayed, and hoped for a better opportunity. When she saw the ad for the Montgomery estate, she hesitated. The pay was tempting, but the rumors scared her. Still, she needed the money. Her daughter was about to start college, and tuition didn't wait for fear. The morning she arrived, the sky was gray, and a light fog hung over the hill. The iron gates creaked open slowly as the guard waved her in. She gripped her small suitcase and looked around. The driveway curved through perfectly cut lawns and flower beds that looked like they'd been painted, not planted. Every window reflected the clouds. The mansion itself was massive. White stone walls, tall pillars, and doors that looked too heavy for one person to open. When she stepped inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. The floor beneath her feet was smooth marble, and her shoes made soft clicks as she walked. A woman with sharp eyes and a neat bun approached her. "You must be Clara," the woman said, glancing at the folder in her hands. "I'm Mrs. Dyer, the head of staff. Follow me." Clara followed her through long hallways lined with paintings. Some of the faces in those paintings looked like they were watching her. The house was quiet, too quiet. "You've heard the stories, I'm sure," Mrs. Dyer said without turning around. "About Mrs. Montgomery." Clara nodded slightly. "They're not all true," the woman continued, "but they're not all lies either. My advice, keep your head down, do your work, and don't talk back. She notices everything. If she calls for you, go quickly. Never make her repeat herself." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said softly. Mrs. Dyer led her to a small room near the servants' quarters. The space was simple: a single bed, a small window, and a wooden dresser. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and to Clara that was enough. "Get some rest," Mrs. Dyer said. "You start at 6 tomorrow. Breakfast for the family is served at 7 sharp. And welcome, I suppose." Clara smiled faintly. "Thank you." When the door closed, she sat on the bed and took a deep breath. The mansion felt like another world, beautiful but cold. She looked at the photo of her daughter she kept in her purse. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Morning came early. The kitchen buzzed with quiet movement as the staff prepared breakfast. Cooks worked with practiced speed, the scent of coffee and toast filling the air. Clara joined in, helping arrange the silverware, checking that every glass shone. She moved carefully, watching how the others worked. At exactly 7, Mrs. Dyer gave a signal. Everyone in position. Moments later, the double doors to the dining hall opened. Vivian Montgomery walked in. She was even more striking in person than the stories had said. Her dress was cream-colored, her hair perfectly styled, her posture flawless. Her eyes, though beautiful, were cold. Beside her walked Charles, tall and quiet. his face buried behind a newspaper. Vivian's gaze swept the room like a searchlight. "Who's new?" she asked. Mrs. Dyer stepped forward. "This is Clara, ma'am. She started today." Vivian looked Clara up and down slowly. "Experience?" "Yes, ma'am. I've worked in hotels and private homes," Clara said. Vivian's lips curved, not into a smile but something close. "We'll see how long that lasts." She sat down and breakfast began. Every movement in the room seemed to pause whenever she raised her fork. Clara poured juice, making sure not to spill a drop. Her hands were steady, her face calm. When she stepped back, Vivian's eyes met hers for a moment, sharp, unreadable. Then she looked away. The rest of the morning passed quietly. After breakfast, Clara cleaned the dining room, polished the silver, and dusted the shelves. Every task was checked by Mrs. Dyer, who said little but watched closely. By afternoon, Clara began to understand why others had left. Vivian inspected everything herself. She walked through rooms without warning, running her finger along surfaces, checking corners most people would never notice. Once she frowned at the way a vase was angled and called 3 maids to fix it. None of them spoke. They just nodded and obeyed. That first week felt endless. Every morning began with nerves. Every night ended with relief that she had survived another day. There were moments when she thought about leaving, but something inside her told her to stay. She needed this chance. And maybe she thought the rumors were just that. Rumors. One evening she was dusting the grand piano in the living room when she heard soft footsteps. Vivian was standing in the doorway. "You missed a spot," Vivian said, pointing to a small corner near the piano legs. Clara knelt down immediately. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll fix it." Vivian watched her for a moment, arms crossed. "Most people argue. You don't." "I don't see the point, ma'am," Clara replied quietly. "If it's wrong, I just fix it." Vivian tilted her head slightly as if surprised by the answer. Then she turned and walked away without another word. After that, their encounters continued, short and sharp like tests. One day it was about how the towels were folded. Another day about the scent of the soap used in the bathrooms. Vivian seemed to be searching for a reason to be disappointed, but Clara gave her none. Weeks passed. The staff began whispering that the new maid might actually last. "She's calm," one cook said. "Too calm. The missus can't get under her skin." Clara didn't pay attention to the gossip. She worked, ate, slept, and repeated. She treated the house like a puzzle she was slowly learning to solve. She memorized every hallway, every sound the house made, every habit the Montgomerys had. Charles rarely spoke to anyone, but once, while Clara was cleaning his study, he looked up from his papers and said, "You're new, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her eyes low. "Most don't stay long." "I've heard that, sir." He gave a faint smile. "Then I hope you prove them wrong." It was the first kind word she had heard in weeks. The days began to blur into a routine. Yet even with the tension, there was something satisfying about it. The mansion, for all its coldness, was always beautiful. When the sun hit the garden in the morning, the glass walls glimmered. Sometimes, when no one was around, Clara would stand near the windows and look at the view, the lake in the distance, the trees bending in the wind. It reminded her that there was still peace somewhere, even here. One Friday evening, the family hosted a small dinner for guests. The staff worked non-stop to prepare. Everything had to be perfect. Clara was assigned to the dining area, making sure the guests had what they needed. As the guests arrived, laughter filled the air. Vivian moved among them gracefully, her smile charming, her tone warm. Watching her, Clara realized something. Vivian wasn't cruel because she enjoyed it. She was cruel because she was afraid of losing control. In front of others, she was flawless. But in private, her voice turned sharp, her eyes tired. Later that night, when the guests had gone, Vivian sat alone in the empty dining room, staring at the untouched dessert plate. Clara was cleaning quietly nearby when Vivian spoke without looking up. "They all pretend," she said softly. "All of them." Clara didn't answer. "Do you ever get tired of pretending, Clara?" Clara paused, her hand stilling on the cloth. "Sometimes, ma'am, but I try to focus on what's real." Vivian looked at her then, studying her face. "And what's real to you?" "My work," Clara said simply. "And my family." Vivian didn't reply. She stood up, adjusted her dress, and walked away. From that night on, something subtle shifted. Vivian didn't smile, but she didn't criticize as often either. She still watched everything, still demanded perfection, but the edge in her tone softened, barely but enough for Clara to notice. One morning, Mrs. Dyer pulled Clara aside. "I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, keep doing it," she whispered. "You've lasted longer than anyone." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm just doing my job." The mansion slowly began to feel less like a cage and more like a challenge she was mastering day by day. She still kept to herself, still avoided gossip. But there were moments of quiet understanding now, small nods, brief words, and an unspoken respect between two women who were very different, but both carried their own kind of strength. Still, the air of mystery around Vivian never disappeared. The staff said she rarely left the house, that she had no friends who visited except for business dinners. Some believed she didn't trust anyone. Others said she didn't know how. Clara didn't judge. She had seen enough of life to understand that people's anger often came from pain. Late one night, when most of the staff had gone to bed, Clara walked through the main hallway to check that the doors were locked. She passed by the library and saw lights still on. Through the open door, Vivian sat at the desk, staring at an old photo frame. Her face looked softer, almost sad. Clara quietly turned away, not wanting to intrude. In that moment, she realized the house wasn't cursed and Vivian wasn't a monster. They were both just people, lonely in different ways, trying to keep something from falling apart. When she finally returned to her room that night, Clara sat by the window, listening to the wind outside. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a strange sense of belonging, not because the mansion welcomed her, but because she refused to let it break her. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this time will be different." Outside, the mansion stood silent as always, its lights glowing faintly against the dark sky. But inside, something small had changed, a new energy, quiet but steady, as if the house itself had started to breathe again. And though no one else could see it yet, the woman everyone said no maid could survive had finally met someone who might. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks quietly became months. For the first time in years, no one had been fired from the Montgomery mansion. The air still carried the same silence, but something about it felt different. The house that had once swallowed every new maid seemed to tolerate one now. Clara continued to move through each day with her calm rhythm. She rose before the sun, tied her apron neatly, and started her work while the rest of the staff yawned and stretched. She was never late, never careless, and never loud. Her quiet strength made the others watch her differently. Some respected her. Others whispered that she must have some secret to staying in Mrs. Montgomery's favor. But Clara didn't care about what they said. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just needed to keep her job, send money to her daughter, and stay out of trouble. Still, even she could feel the unspoken tension that filled the house every time Vivian walked into a room. Vivian, as always, looked perfect. Her dresses were pressed smooth, her heels clicked sharply on the marble, and her perfume lingered in the air long after she passed. But her eyes, those cold gray eyes, carried something new. It wasn't anger anymore. It was curiosity. She had been watching Clara. It started in small ways. She'd appear suddenly in rooms Clara was cleaning, stand at the doorway without saying anything, just observing. Once, when Clara was arranging fresh flowers in the hall, she turned and found Vivian standing behind her. "Why roses?" Vivian asked suddenly. Clara blinked, surprised by the question. "They were in bloom, ma'am, and I thought the color might brighten the hallway." Vivian's gaze lingered on the petals. "My husband likes roses," she said quietly, and then she walked away. It was strange. Vivian never shared personal details with anyone. The staff spoke about her like she was made of ice. But now she was showing cracks, small ones, barely visible. But they're all the same. Clara continued working as usual, but every day felt like a test she didn't know she was taking. Vivian would point out the smallest things. How the napkins were folded, how the curtains were drawn, even how the scent of the cleaner lingered too strongly in one room. Clara never argued. She just nodded, fixed it, and carried on. One afternoon, while polishing the silver, Clara overheard two maids whispering in the corner. "She's still here," one said. 3 months now, I know. Maybe the missus finally found someone she can't break." "Don't say that too loud," the other hissed. "She'll hear you and prove you wrong." Clara smiled faintly to herself and kept working. She didn't think of it as surviving anyone. She just believed in doing her best quietly, the way her mother had taught her years ago. But the mansion was not a place where quiet hearts went unnoticed for long. One evening, a storm rolled across the city. The sky turned deep gray, thunder cracked, and rain lashed against the windows. Most of the staff stayed in the kitchen, trying to keep warm near the stoves. Clara, however, had been asked to take tea to Mrs. Montgomery in the sitting room. When she entered, Vivian was standing by the window, staring out into the storm. "Set it on the table," she said without turning. Clara placed the tray gently and waited, unsure whether to leave. The silence in the room was heavy. The only sound was the rain. "Do you ever wonder?" Vivian said suddenly, her voice low. "Why people talk so much about what happens in this house?" Clara looked up slightly. "I suppose it's because people always talk about what they don't understand, ma'am." Vivian turned then, her expression unreadable. "And what do you understand, Clara?" Clara hesitated. "Only that every house has its own kind of noise. Some are loud because people argue. Others are quiet because people are lonely." For a moment Vivian didn't respond. Her eyes softened, but just a little. Then she looked back out the window. "You may go," she said. Clara nodded and quietly left, closing the door behind her. That short conversation stayed in her mind for days. She hadn't meant to say anything deep. It had just slipped out. But perhaps that honesty was what had startled Vivian. The next week, a new rule came down from Mrs. Montgomery herself. Every room would be deep cleaned and reorganized. The order sent the staff into a frenzy. It meant longer hours and heavier work, but no one dared complain. Clara was assigned to the master bedroom and sitting area, Vivian's private spaces. It was a job no one wanted because it meant working directly under her watch. When Clara entered the room, Vivian was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair. "Don't touch the wardrobe," she said sharply. "Everything else, yes. But not that." "Yes, ma'am." The hours stretched long. Clara dusted, polished, scrubbed, and folded. The room smelled of lavender and perfume. Vivian didn't speak much, but she kept glancing at Clara in the mirror, as if studying the way she moved. "You don't rush," Vivian said suddenly. Clara looked up. "Pardon, ma'am." "You don't rush. Most people hurry through their work like they want to escape it. But you take your time." Clara smiled a little. "My mother used to say if you rush, you'll only have to do it twice." Vivian didn't smile back, but her reflection softened. "Your mother must have been a patient woman." "She was," Clara said quietly. For the first time, the conversation felt human. No commands, no sharp words, just two women talking. After that day, Vivian's behavior shifted again. She wasn't suddenly kind, but she wasn't cruel either. She gave fewer criticisms, and sometimes, when no one was watching, she even said thank you. The other maids noticed and couldn't believe it. "You've charmed the devil herself," one whispered jokingly. Clara laughed it off. She didn't see it as charm. She just believed that sometimes people acted unkind because no one treated them with patience. But even patience can be tested. One morning, the mansion was thrown into chaos. A necklace, an expensive diamond piece worth more than some houses, had gone missing from Mrs. Montgomery's jewelry case. The staff were gathered in the hall, all pale and tense. Vivian stood at the top of the staircase, her expression cold as glass. "No one leaves this house until it's found," she said. Not one person. The search began. Every room, every drawer, every pocket was checked. People whispered nervously, afraid of what might happen if it wasn't found. Vivian's anger wasn't loud. It was quiet, sharp, and terrifying. When she entered the laundry room where Clara was folding linens, the whole space seemed to freeze. Vivian's eyes swept over the baskets and shelves. "Where were you this morning?" she asked. "In the kitchen, ma'am." "Then here. You didn't go upstairs?"
"No, ma'am." Vivian's gaze lingered on her for a long, heavy moment.
Then she turned and left without another word. By evening, the necklace was found, tangled in the lining of a dress that had gone to the cleaner's room. It had fallen through by accident. Vivian didn't apologize, but the next morning, a small envelope appeared on Clara's bedside table with a note that read, "Thank you for your honesty." Clara didn't mention it to anyone. She just kept working. Slowly, quietly, a strange respect grew between her and Vivian. It wasn't friendship, there was still distance, still a wall between employer and employee. But there was recognition. Vivian began to trust her in small ways. She asked Clara to handle more personal tasks, choosing flowers, arranging her reading room, even packing her luggage for short trips. One evening, As Clara placed a shawl over Vivian's shoulders before a dinner event, Vivian caught her eye in the mirror and said, "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Clara paused. "No, ma'am." "Why?" Clara thought for a moment. "Because fear doesn't make work better. It only makes hands shake." Vivian turned slightly, studying her. "You speak like someone who's seen too much of life." Clara smiled softly. "Maybe just enough to understand people a little." Vivian said nothing more, but when she left the room she looked calmer than before. Around that time the mansion started feeling more alive. The staff noticed it too. Vivian's temper wasn't as sharp, and even Charles seemed to come out of his quiet shell more often. He spent more time at home, sharing brief smiles with his wife, who seemed to be trying in her own way to be warmer. One Saturday afternoon, Clara was cleaning the garden terrace when Charles approached her. "You've done good work here," he said, his tone gentle. "Thank you, sir. My wife says you've been helpful to her," he added. "That's where." Clara didn't know what to say. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he smiled faintly. "Keep doing it. You've brought something this house needed." That night when Clara lay in bed, she thought about what he'd said. She hadn't done anything special, at least not on purpose. She'd just listened, worked hard, and stayed calm. But maybe sometimes that was all a house like this needed. Someone who didn't add more noise. Still, she knew better than to think the story was over. The Montgomery mansion was never peaceful for long. One rainy morning, she found Vivian sitting alone in the breakfast room, untouched tea in front of her. She looked tired. "Are you feeling all right, ma'am?" Clara asked carefully. Vivian nodded slowly. "I'm fine. Just tired." Clara hesitated. "You should rest, ma'am." Vivian gave a small, bitter laugh. "Rest isn't easy when people expect perfection." Clara met her eyes. "Then maybe they need to learn what enough looks like." Vivian looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You sound like someone my mother might have liked." It was the closest thing to warmth Clara had ever heard in her voice. From that day, their interactions carried a quiet understanding. Vivian still gave orders, still kept her distance, but there was no cruelty. Sometimes she'd ask small questions about Clara's daughter, or her hometown, and once, after Clara mentioned her daughter's dream of studying medicine, Vivian quietly arranged for an extra month's bonus to be added to her pay. She never said it directly, but Clara knew. The staff began noticing the change. "It's strange," one said, "but Mrs. Montgomery actually smiles sometimes now." Clara would just nod and continue her work. She knew that behind every sharp person was a story. Vivian's story, whatever it was, had softened over time. Not through confrontation, but through quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return. Yet deep down, Clara sensed something else. Vivian still carried sadness, something unspoken that even kindness couldn't fully reach. Sometimes she'd sit by the window at night staring out at the hills, her hand resting lightly on a framed photo no one else ever saw. Clara didn't ask. Some pain didn't need words. It just needed space. By the end of the 6th month, the mansion was quieter but not heavy anymore. The garden bloomed brighter. The halls smelled of fresh polish and flowers. The people inside had changed, even if they didn't realize it. And at the heart of it all was a woman who had done nothing dramatic. No rebellion, no bold act, just steady work and a kind heart that refused to break. In a house where no maid had ever survived, Clara had not only survived, she had started to heal something invisible. But deep down she knew life had a way of testing even the strongest piece, and soon enough another storm, one far more dangerous than the weather, was waiting quietly on the horizon. The air around the mansion had started to feel lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted. The days passed quietly, each one blending into the next. The staff no longer whispered in fear every time Mrs. Montgomery walked by. They still respected her, of course, but now there was a calmness in the way they moved. Clara continued her work with the same steady hands and humble grace. She didn't see herself as someone who had changed the house. She only saw herself as someone doing what needed to be done. But everyone else could see the difference. Even the gardeners noticed. They said the roses in the courtyard had never bloomed so wide, that the soil itself seemed less hard. It was as if the mansion had started breathing again after holding its breath for too long. Vivian, too, had changed in quiet ways. She still expected perfection, still liked things done a certain way, but her voice had softened. She said please sometimes, and thank you. It startled the staff at first, but Clara knew it wasn't a trick. It was real, small steps from someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Still, not everything was peaceful. There were days when Vivian disappeared into her study for hours. The staff knew better than to disturb her. Those were the days when the tension returned to the walls, as if the house remembered its old habits. One afternoon, as Clara was polishing the silver in the dining hall, she heard raised voices from the hallway. It was rare. Arguments were almost unheard of in this house. She recognized the voices immediately. Charles and Vivian. "You can't keep shutting people out," Charles was saying, his tone calm but firm. "And you can't tell me how to live in my own home," Vivian replied, her words sharp-clipped. "I'm not trying to control you," he said. "I'm trying to help you." "Help me? By surrounding me with strangers who don't understand me?" There was silence, heavy and painful. Clara stood still, unsure whether to keep working or move away. Then Charles spoke again, softer this time. "You've been different lately," he said. "Better, I think. And I think we both know why." Vivian didn't answer, and Clara didn't dare breathe. Then footsteps echoed down the hall and the sound faded. Clara quickly turned away and focused on her work, pretending she hadn't heard a thing, but her heart was racing. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the golden light filled the halls, Vivian entered the dining room. She was composed again, her expression calm, her voice smooth. "Clara," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Would you stay after dinner tonight? I'd like to go over a few things." "Yes, ma'am." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure what a few things meant. Dinner that night was quiet. The usual chatter between husband and wife was missing. Charles read the newspaper and Vivian picked at her food. When it was over, Clara cleared the table and waited near the kitchen until Mrs. Dyer nodded for her to go. She found Vivian in the sitting room, standing by the window again. The same window she always went to when her thoughts were too heavy. "Do you ever feel," Vivian said suddenly, "like people expect too much from you? Like no matter what you do, it's never enough?" Clara hesitated. "Sometimes, yes." Vivian turned, studying her face. "And what do you do then?" "I remind myself that I'm doing my best," Clara said simply. "That's all I can give." Vivian's eyes softened. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Clara said quietly. "But it's better than feeling trapped by what others think." Vivian looked away, her hand resting on the curtain. "You make it sound like you've never failed." "I've failed plenty, ma'am, but I try not to stay there." For a long moment they stood in silence. Then Vivian whispered almost to herself, "My mother used to say something like that. She was strong too, stronger than I ever was." There was a sadness in her voice that Clara hadn't heard before, a small, fragile truth breaking through the layers of pride. That night marked another shift between them. Vivian no longer spoke to Clara only as a maid. Sometimes she spoke to her as if she were someone who understood. Over the next few weeks, Vivian began asking for Clara's help more often, not with cleaning, but with small choices. What flowers looked best in the hallway? What scent of soap to use in the guest bathrooms? Whether the new curtains made the rooms look too cold? Clara always answered honestly. One afternoon, as they worked together rearranging the living room, Vivian sighed and said, "I never used to care about things like this. I used to just tell people what to do and walk away." "What changed, ma'am?" Clara asked gently. Vivian smiled faintly. "You did," Clara looked surprised. "Me," Vivian nodded. "You're patient. You listen. You make people want to do things right, not because they have to, but because they want to." Clara didn't know what to say. She only smiled and said, "Thank you, ma'am." For a while, the mansion felt lighter again. Even Charles seemed more at ease. There were evenings when laughter echoed faintly from the dining room. The staff started saying that the house finally had warmth in it, but life has a way of testing the peace it gives. One morning, Charles left for a business trip. He was supposed to be gone for 2 days. Vivian saw him off, standing on the steps as his car disappeared down the long driveway. She didn't wave. She just watched until the car was gone, then turned away quietly. That evening, the storm came. The wind howled around the mansion, and thunder rolled across the sky. The power flickered twice and the lights dimmed. Clara and the other staff moved quickly, lighting candles in the hallways and checking the windows. Vivian stayed in her room reading by the light of a lamp. Clara was in the laundry room folding linens when Mrs. Dyer rushed in, her face pale. Something's wrong, she whispered. In the study, Clara didn't think twice. She followed Mrs. Dyer up the stairs. When they reached the study, they found Vivian kneeling beside Charles, who was slumped in his chair, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He just fell, Vivian said, her voice shaking for the first time Clara had ever heard. He fell. Mrs. Dyer froze, but Clara moved fast. Call the doctor, she said firmly. Now. She checked his pulse. It was weak, but still there. She remembered the first aid course she had taken years ago at a hotel job. Her hands moved quickly, gently supporting his head and keeping him still. She didn't panic. She just focused. The minutes dragged on. The rain pounded the windows, thunder rumbling above. Vivian sat frozen, her hand clutching the edge of the desk. When the paramedics finally arrived, Clara guided them to the room. They worked quickly, their voices calm and professional. Vivian stood aside, tears in her eyes, but silent. When they carried Charles out on a stretcher, Clara followed them to the door, holding an umbrella over Vivian as the rain poured down. Hours later, the house was quiet again. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of rain and worry. Vivian sat in the waiting room at the hospital, her hands clasped tightly together. Clara sat nearby, silent but present. Neither of them spoke. When the doctor finally came out and said that Charles was stable, Vivian closed her eyes and let out a breath that sounded like it carried years of fear. She turned to Clara, her eyes red but soft. You stayed, she whispered. I wasn't going to leave you, ma'am. Vivian looked down for a long moment. Everyone else always leaves, she said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She just sat with her, the two of them surrounded by the hum of the hospital. They returned to the mansion early the next morning. The sun was rising and the wet ground sparkled under the pale light. Vivian walked in first, her steps slower than usual. She didn't say a word. For the next few days, she barely spoke at all. The house was silent again, but not cold, just tired. Clara made sure she ate, brought her tea, and kept the rooms clean. She never pushed her to talk. She just stayed near, quietly present. One afternoon, Vivian appeared in the kitchen doorway. You should take a rest, she said softly. I'm fine, ma'am. Vivian nodded. I know you are, but rest anyway. When Clara smiled, she did too. A real smile, small and weary, but real. A week later, Charles returned home, looking pale but recovering. The mansion filled with quiet relief. Vivian stayed close to him, more gentle than anyone had ever seen her. And every time she passed Clara, she gave a small nod, a silent thank you. It was after this that people in the neighborhood began to talk differently about the Montgomery estate. No longer the house where no maid survived, but the place where something strange had happened, something like change. And though no one outside really understood what had changed or how, those inside the mansion did. They had seen it. It wasn't just about kindness or patience. It was about what happens when someone chooses to stay when everyone else runs away. Clara never spoke about that night. She didn't see herself as a hero. She only saw a woman who did what needed to be done, but Vivian saw it differently. One morning, she called Clara into her study. On the desk lay a small, neatly folded envelope. This is for you, she said. Clara hesitated. Ma'am, I don't need... It's not a gift, Vivian interrupted gently. It's a thank you. For that night, for everything. Clara looked at her, unsure what to say. You did the impossible, Vivian continued quietly. You made this house feel like a home again. Clara felt her throat tighten. I just did my job, ma'am. Vivian smiled softly. Maybe, but you did it with something no one else had. What's that? Heart, Vivian said simply. That day, as Clara walked out into the courtyard, the sun was shining. The air was warm and the roses she had planted months ago were in full bloom. She stood there for a while looking at them, breathing in the fresh scent. She thought about how far things had come, from fear and silence to something that almost felt like peace. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: whatever storms came next, she would face them the same way she always had, calm, steady, and full of quiet strength, because sometimes the most powerful people in the world are the ones who simply refuse to give up. When life at the mansion slowly began to settle after Charles's recovery, there was a quiet sense of gratitude in the air. The people who worked there noticed how differently things felt now. No one walked on eggshells anymore. Vivian spoke to the staff in a tone that felt almost kind. The doors that once seemed to shut out the world now opened more often, letting in fresh air and sunshine. Clara continued her work like she always had. Steady, calm, never expecting anything more than her duties. But deep down she felt something had changed for her too. For the first time she felt seen. Not just as a maid, but as a person. Someone whose presence made a difference. Vivian seemed to notice that as well. She asked for Clara's help more often, not just for tasks around the house, but for things that required thought and trust. One morning, Vivian called her into the sitting room. There were papers spread across the coffee table and she looked tired. "Clara," she said softly, "I'm thinking about opening the guest house again." Clara nodded. "That sounds nice, ma'am." Vivian hesitated. "It used to be a mess. Charles had it closed off years ago. But I thought maybe it could be used for something meaningful now." "What kind of something?" Clara asked, curious. Vivian leaned back in her chair. "I don't know yet. Maybe a small retreat for people who need rest. Or for women who are starting over." Clara's heart warmed at the thought. "That's a beautiful idea." Vivian smiled faintly. "Would you help me with it? You have a good sense for what feels right." "I'd be happy to, ma'am." And just like that, a new chapter began in that grand house, a quiet project that slowly brought new life into the place. Over the next few weeks, Clara spent her mornings cleaning out the guest house. Dust had covered everything. Cobwebs stretched across the windows. But she didn't mind. She opened the windows wide, letting in sunlight and fresh air. The air smelled like old wood and rain, and for some reason it felt peaceful. Vivian joined her sometimes. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty anymore. She carried boxes, wiped shelves, and even laughed when dust made her sneeze. The sight of her working beside the maid was something no one in the mansion would have believed a few months ago. Mrs. Dyer often watched them from a distance, shaking her head with a soft smile. "Never thought I'd see the day," she'd whisper. As days turned into weeks, the guest house began to change. Fresh paint brightened the walls. Old furniture was repaired. New curtains hung by the windows. Clara found an old piano in the corner. Its keys yellowed and out of tune, but she couldn't bear to throw it out. "It still has beauty," she said. Vivian agreed. Sometimes when the work was done for the day, Clara would sit by that piano and run her fingers across the keys. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was soft and soothing. Vivian would often listen from the doorway, her face unreadable but her eyes distant, as if remembering something from long ago. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the air grew cool, Vivian sat beside Clara at the piano. "Did you ever take lessons?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am. I just listen and try to follow what I hear." Vivian smiled gently. "My mother used to play. I never learned. I always thought I'd have time one day." "Maybe it's not too late," Clara said quietly. Vivian gave her a small look of surprise, then laughed softly. "Maybe not." They sat there for a while, the sound of imperfect notes filling the room, blending with the chirping of crickets outside. It was simple, peaceful, something neither of them had realized they'd needed. But not everyone saw the changes in Vivian kindly. People in town began to whisper. They said the new wife had gone soft, that she was letting the staff have too much say, that she was acting strange. Some said the maid had too much influence. Clara didn't pay attention to gossip, but sometimes she heard the gardeners whispering when they thought she wasn't nearby. She didn't take offense. People always talked when they didn't understand something. Vivian, however, couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, she received a letter from one of her husband's associates, a polite but pointed note about maintaining appearances. She read it in silence, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Later that evening, Clara noticed her sitting alone in the garden, looking at the sky. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" Vivian hesitated, then said, "Do you ever feel like people want you to fit into a box you don't belong in?" Clara nodded slowly. "All the time. And what do you do?" "I stop trying to fit," Clara said. "If I bend myself just to please others, I lose the part that makes me who I am." Vivian gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You always make things sound so simple." "It's not simple," Clara said. "It's just the truth." Vivian nodded, her eyes soft but sad. "I wish I'd met you years ago. Maybe I'd have done things differently." The wind rustled the trees above them, and for a while they just sat in silence. As the guest house neared completion, word spread about Vivian's plan. To everyone's surprise, Charles supported her completely. He even offered to fund the project and invite a few partners to help expand it. Vivian declined politely. "This isn't about business," she said. "It's about people." Charles smiled in quiet admiration. "Then I trust your vision." The day the guest house officially reopened, the staff gathered in the courtyard. It wasn't a big event. No fancy speeches or crowds. Just the people who had built it with their hands and hearts. Vivian stood at the door with Clara beside her. She looked around at the faces watching her, some smiling, some teary, and said softly, "This house once stood for power and perfection. But today I hope it stands for something different. Healing." Her voice trembled a little, but no one minded. It was real. When she turned to Clara, she said quietly, "This is as much yours as it is mine." Clara shook her head. "I just helped," Vivian smiled. "You helped me remember who I am. That's worth more than help." Over the next few weeks, women began to visit the guest house. Some were young, some older. Each one came with a story, each one carrying something heavy in her heart. Vivian and Clara welcomed them with warmth. They didn't ask too many questions. They simply gave them a place to rest, to breathe. Clara would bring tea, listen to them talk. Sometimes just sit in silence with them. She knew that sometimes silence healed more than words. Vivian, too, found comfort in those visits. She realized that giving others peace gave her peace as well. One night, as the last guest left, she sat with Clara on the porch of the guest house. The moon was bright, the air cool. "You know," Vivian said, "for a long time I thought kindness made you weak. I thought power meant control. But it's the other way around." Clara smiled gently. "Kindness is the hardest thing sometimes, but it always wins." Vivian nodded. "You've changed me, Clara. You've changed this house. Maybe even saved it." Clara looked out at the garden. "I think we saved each other, ma'am." Vivian didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You don't have to call me ma'am anymore." Clara looked at her in surprise. But Vivian smiled softly. "Just call me Vivian, please." Clara hesitated, then said quietly, "All right, Vivian." The way she said it was gentle, respectful, but it carried warmth, a connection that had grown naturally, without force. The weeks passed peacefully, but life has a way of testing the calm it gives. One morning, a car pulled into the driveway. It was sleek, black, and unfamiliar. A man stepped out holding a briefcase. He asked to see Vivian. When she met him in the study, he explained that Charles's company was facing a serious problem, one that could affect their finances, even their home. Vivian listened carefully. When the man left, she sat at her desk, staring at the papers he'd given her. She didn't panic, but Clara could see the weight on her shoulders. That night, Clara knocked on her door gently. "Would you like some tea?" Vivian nodded, grateful. When Clara handed her the cup, she whispered, "It never ends, does it?" "What doesn't?" "The fighting to stay steady." "The storms?" Clara thought for a moment. "Maybe they never end," she said softly. "But maybe that's why we learn to stand stronger each time." Vivian looked up, her eyes tired but full of quiet strength. "You really believe that?" "I do," Clara said simply. Vivian smiled faintly. "Then maybe I can believe it too." The next morning, Vivian made a decision. She called her husband and said she wanted to help manage the situation herself. She wanted to be part of the solution, not just the worried wife waiting at home. Charles agreed, impressed by her determination. Days turned into weeks again, full of meetings and calls. Clara made sure she ate, rested, and had moments of calm between the chaos. She became not just her maid, but her quiet anchor. When the company finally stabilized, everyone breathed easier. Vivian came home one evening exhausted but smiling. "We made it," she said simply. Clara smiled back. "I knew you would." That night, the mansion was filled with laughter again. The staff shared a meal together in the kitchen, something that had never happened before. Vivian even joined them, sitting at the long table, laughing quietly at the cook's jokes. It felt like a family, one built not by blood or title, but by heart and endurance. As the night grew late, Vivian stood by the window, looking out at the glowing guest house in the distance. She said softly, "Do you know what's strange, Clara?" "What's that?" "I used to think this house was cursed, that it broke everyone who came near it, but maybe it was just waiting for the right person to teach it how to breathe again." Clara looked at her. then at the house that now seemed to shine under the moonlight. Maybe it just needed someone to believe it could change. Vivian nodded. Maybe it needed both of us. The quiet stretched between them, warm and peaceful. The house that once carried fear now carried stories of hope. The walls that once echoed with tension now held laughter. And though Clara never saw herself as anything special, everyone around her knew she had done the impossible. She had not only survived the mansion, she had healed it. The mansion was quiet again, but this time the silence was peaceful, not heavy. Months had passed since the day the guest house reopened, and since Vivian's project began helping others. The people who came and went left behind traces of gratitude and warmth, and somehow, that warmth stayed. Clara had grown used to seeing new faces every few weeks, women who arrived carrying invisible burdens, then left with lighter hearts. She didn't ask questions, but she always offered a gentle smile and a listening ear. Sometimes that was all a person needed. Vivian continued to work beside her, though she was different now, calmer, gentler, and more grounded. She spent less time in her study and more time in the garden. She laughed more. Even Charles noticed. He often said that the house felt alive again. One morning, as the sun rose and the dew glistened on the grass, Clara stood by the window with a cup of tea. The light stretched across the fields, painting the world gold. She smiled softly. She never thought she'd stay this long. She had once come here just looking for work, but what she'd found was purpose. The door behind her opened and Vivian walked in quietly. "You're up early," she said with a gentle smile. "I couldn't sleep," Clara replied. "The morning air felt too nice to waste." Vivian nodded. "I know that feeling." They stood side by side for a while, watching the sun climb higher. "I've been thinking," Vivian said after a pause, "about everything that's happened. About this place." Clara looked at her. "What about it?" Vivian's eyes softened. "It doesn't feel like the same house anymore. It used to feel like a cage. Now it feels alive, safe. And that's because of you." Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am. You changed it." Vivian smiled faintly. "Maybe. But you were the reason I wanted to." There was silence for a moment, then Vivian said, "I think it's time I gave something back to you." Clara frowned slightly. "You've already given me more than enough." Vivian shook her head. "No, you've earned more than just gratitude." She handed Clara a folded piece of paper. "Open it." Clara opened it carefully. Her eyes widened. It was a deed. "It's a small house on the edge of town," Vivian said softly. "It used to belong to my aunt. It's been empty for years. I've had it fixed up. It's yours now." Clara's hands trembled slightly. "Ma'am, I can't accept this." "You can," Vivian said firmly but kindly. "You've given me something I can never repay. A home isn't just walls and a roof. It's the feeling inside it. You brought that feeling here. Now it's time you have a place that's your own." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She tried to speak but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." "I don't know what to say," Vivian smiled. "Then don't say anything. Just promise you'll visit." Clara laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "Of course I will." The next few weeks passed with quiet preparation. The other staff helped Clara pack her things. They hugged her one by one, each of them with tears in their eyes. Mrs. Dyer said, "I've worked here for 30 years and I've never seen this house so full of light." "You did that, dear. Don't ever forget it." Clara hugged her tightly. "I'll miss you." "You better come back," Mrs. Dyer said with a shaky laugh. "Or I'll come find you myself." The morning she left, the whole household gathered by the driveway. Vivian stood beside Charles, both of them smiling proudly. As Clara loaded her last bag into the car, she turned to look at the mansion one more time. The sunlight hit the windows, making them shimmer. She remembered her first day there, the fear, the whispers, the coldness. It felt like a lifetime ago. Vivian walked up and hugged her gently. "Go live your life, Clara. You've more than earned it." Clara smiled. "Thank you for believing in me," Vivian whispered. "No, thank you for teaching me how." As the car pulled away, Clara looked out the window. The mansion grew smaller in the distance, surrounded by trees and blooming flowers. It no longer looked intimidating. It looked like home, just not hers anymore. The small house Vivian had given her was simple but beautiful. It had white walls, a cozy porch, and a big oak tree out front. There was a little garden patch, too, where Clara planted herbs and flowers. For the first time in years, she woke up to silence that belonged to her. In the morning, she sat on the porch with her tea, watching the world wake up. Sometimes she missed the sound of footsteps in the long marble halls, the smell of the mansion's kitchen, the soft laughter of the staff, but mostly, she felt peace. She started helping at the local community center a few days a week, cooking and cleaning. People soon realized she wasn't just kind. She had a gift for making others feel calm. Those who were troubled often came to her for advice. She never said much, but her words always carried truth. One day, while she was organizing supplies, she heard a familiar voice at the door. "Still working too hard, I see." Clara turned and smiled. Vivian stood there, dressed simply, her hair tied back. "You came." "Of course," Vivian said with a grin. "I promised I'd visit." They sat together over tea, talking about everything, the guest house, the people they'd helped, the laughter that now filled the mansion. "It feels strange," Vivian said softly. "To have peace after so many years of chaos," Clara nodded. "Sometimes peace feels louder than noise. You have to learn to sit with it." Vivian smiled. "You always have the right words." "It's just what life taught me," Clara replied. When Vivian left that day, she hugged her tightly. "You'll always have a home with me," she whispered. "I know," Clara said. "But I think we both found our homes already." Months passed, and the bond between them never faded. Vivian continued her charity work, and the guest house flourished. More people came seeking rest and healing. Vivian often mentioned Clara to them, the woman who had taught her that strength didn't always roar, sometimes it whispered. Clara's house became a quiet refuge too. Neighbors often came by to talk, share stories, or just sit in peace. She always welcomed them with tea and a gentle smile. Her days were simple but full. One afternoon, a young girl from the town came to visit. She had just started working as a maid in one of the local estates and was nervous. "Everyone says I won't last long," she told Clara, eyes downcast. Clara smiled softly. "Don't let what they say decide who you are. Just do your work with heart. That's what matters," the girl nodded. "That's what they said about the mansion on the hill, too. That no one lasted there." Clara chuckled quietly. "I heard that story once. Do you think it's true?" the girl asked. Clara looked out the window, her eyes distant but warm. "It was once, but not anymore." The girl smiled, not realizing she was talking to the very woman from the stories whispered in town. When the girl left, Clara sat back and closed her eyes. She could still see the mansion in her mind, the golden halls, the tall windows, the faces of the people she'd grown to care for. And most of all, she could see Vivian's smile, the one that had once been so rare. She thought about all that had happened. The fear, the loneliness, the courage it took to stay when everything in her wanted to run. She hadn't just survived. She had changed something far greater than herself. One day, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It was from Vivian. "Dear Clara, I wanted to tell you that the guest house has now become something even bigger than I imagined. We've turned it into a small foundation. It's helping more women every month, offering them not just a place to stay but a way to rebuild. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Every time I walk through the garden, I think of you. The roses you planted still bloom brighter than any others. Maybe that's your magic. You make things grow even when they shouldn't. Charles sends his regards. He's doing well. The house feels full now, and so do I. I hope your little home brings you the same peace you gave us." With love and gratitude, Vivian Clara read the letter twice, her eyes misty. Then she placed it carefully in a wooden box beside her bed, where she kept small things that meant the most: a dried rose petal from the mansion garden, a locket her mother had given her, and now, this letter. Years passed quietly. The seasons changed, and so did Clara. Her hair turned silver, but her spirit stayed strong. People in town came to know her as someone wise and kind, the one who always knew how to comfort others. One summer afternoon, she received another letter, this time from the Guest House Foundation. It was an invitation to a celebration marking 10 years since its founding. The letter said, "We hope you'll come. None of this would have been possible without you." Clara smiled and decided to go. When she arrived at the mansion gates, memories flooded back. Everything looked both the same and different. The flowers were brighter, the windows gleamed, and laughter echoed from the courtyard. Vivian greeted her at the entrance, her hair streaked with silver but her eyes still warm. She hugged Clara tightly. You came. I couldn't miss it, Clara said. They walked through the gardens together. The roses were in full bloom, the air fragrant and sweet. Guests moved about, talking, laughing, full of life. Vivian turned to her and said softly, Do you see this? You did this, Clara shook her head. We did this, Vivian smiled. Yes, we did. Later, as the sun set, they stood side by side, watching the golden light fade across the hills. The house glowed behind them, full of people, full of warmth. Clara looked at it and said, You know, when I first came here, I was scared. Everyone said no maid lasted long. But maybe it was never about lasting. Maybe it was about healing. Vivian nodded slowly. Maybe it was about finding light in places no one thought it could exist. They stood in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need words. As the stars appeared one by one, Clara thought about her journey, from a quiet maid to the heart that healed a broken house. She didn't see herself as special, but the truth was she had done the impossible. She hadn't just survived. She had transformed everything around her, with patience, with love, and with quiet courage. And as the night deepened and the laughter of the guests echoed softly in the distance, she smiled to herself, because she finally understood sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the most ordinary hearts.